Prince William is reportedly causing quite a stir behind the palace walls, and it all traces back to a clash that took everyone by surprise, but is now the talk of the town. This drama unfolded at a charity event focused on rural development at the Royal Horticultural Hall, a place you wouldn't expect to be the backdrop for such a feud, but that's where things took a turn. What started as a routine Tuesday afternoon, with Princess Anne meeting dignitaries, quickly morphed into a moment of public disrespect that royal protocol usually keeps in check. And what's even more shocking is that it all played out in front of journalists, with a photographer perfectly placed to capture every moment, making you think, wait, what just happened? Princess Anne, dressed in a structured navy coat and her signature brooch, was doing what she's done for more than 50 years, observing a display of local produce without a hint of scandal. The schedule was tight, everything was proceeding smoothly, and then Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, stepped into the hall through a side entrance. Here's the first odd part. She wasn't on the official guest list for the main stage. Nobody expected her there, yet she moved through the crowd confidently, stopped a few feet from Princess Anne, waited for a moment of silence, and then approached. Rather than bowing or greeting her as protocol dictates, she launched into a loud, sharp statement, telling Princess Anne that the recent estate funding changes were a personal insult to her family. That alone is shocking, a woman uninvited to the event directly confronting a senior royal about a family issue in a public setting. This wasn't just a moment of poor judgment or a lapse of emotion, it was a deliberate choice to stir up drama. And how Princess Anne responded speaks volumes about her resilience in this institution for 5 decades. Rather than reacting immediately, she took a moment to adjust her gloves. She turned towards the crowd, completely composed, after 3 seconds of silence enveloped the room. Rather than addressing Laura's accusation, she simply inquired if the security team had confirmed the guest list for that afternoon. That was it. No engagement with the topic at hand. Instead, she questioned Laura's right to even be there. It was a dismissal so quick and precise that it likely hurt more than any debate could. Witnesses say Laura blushed deeply and stepped forward to confront Princess Anne directly. She accused the princess of hiding behind protocol and claimed that the recent audit was aimed explicitly at Camilla's family. Laura asserted that everyone was aware of the secret meetings with the Prince of Wales, and her voice echoed across the room, prompting reporters in the back to rush for their notebooks. At this point, it's hard to ignore that a freelance photographer had already been capturing the moment, the sound of his camera shutter cutting through the rain, drumming on the glass roof. Someone wanted this clash to be recorded. Princess Anne then signaled to her protection officer, who made his way through the crowd and firmly asked Laura to move to the lobby. He stated that her presence was no longer suitable. The whole episode lasted just under 2 minutes, but it completely disrupted the carefully managed vibe of the event. Almost immediately, questions surfaced about how Laura had even gained access to the hall, considering the strict security at the entrance. Laura wasn't one of the primary guests. Upon checking the logs, staff discovered that an invitation had been issued by the local regional director, a man with a loose connection to Camilla's family, who had been convinced to add Laura to the list at the last minute. By the evening, that regional director had been suspended. The invitation was marked as a security breach. The palace responded by conducting a thorough review of all regional access protocols, determined to prevent this from happening again, and simultaneously building a case against those who supported Camilla's family. But what's really intriguing about the timeline is that within an hour of the clash, another question arose. Where was Camilla while all this unfolded? The security log showed that Camilla's car had been idling just 3 blocks away from the hall, even though her official schedule had her at a board meeting in the city. It was there for 15 minutes and left right when Princess Anne moved to the second booth, which definitely raises eyebrows. It appears that Camilla's side of the family was testing the institution, pushing boundaries, and searching for limits. Meanwhile, Prince William found out about the situation while on a conference call. He cut that call short and instructed his chief of staff to retrieve the raw footage from the photographer, eager to see what had actually taken place and how far the disrespect had gone. Reports suggest he wasn't trying to find a diplomatic solution. He was after evidence of misconduct. The atmosphere in his office felt chilly as he watched the footage on a large screen, observing how Laura stood and the crowd's reaction. At that moment, he decided patience was no longer an option. He called the king and informed him that he was taking control of the disciplinary process without waiting for permission. He briefed the king on the events and their implications, making it clear that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The king listened quietly and granted him the authority to act as needed. Princess Anne walked out through the main exit, waving at the crowd and heading to her car without acknowledging the press. In terms of the work, the charity showcase had been a success, but optics told a different story. It was a public disaster for the monarchy. They had suffered a blatant disrespect, and the internal hierarchy had been challenged in a very visible way. Staff members began to pack up displays, anxious about how their efforts might be overshadowed by the unfolding scandal. Now, let's consider Princess Anne's perspective during the ride back from the hall, where her strategy began to crystallize. Sitting in the back of the official state vehicle, she stared straight ahead with her hands folded over her purse. She didn't glance at her phone or converse with her aide. Instead, she was likely replaying the confrontation in her mind, analyzing the timing of every word used against her, dissecting the breach of decorum. This person has been entrenched in royal duty for more than 50 years. She's weathered protests and dealt with years of intense media focus. For her, protocol is not something to take lightly. It's the foundation that upholds the monarchy itself. When she finally chose to speak, the first thing she wanted to know was about the regional director who had sent out the invitation. Was he informed about his suspension? Her voice remained calm and emotionless. The aide confirmed that the director had been dismissed within an hour of the incident. Anne nodded, stating that such failures couldn't be tolerated. She pointed out that the security of the institution began right at the front door. Instead of naming Laura Lopes directly, she referred to what happened as a breach of decorum. That's quite a cold way to describe a personal attack, but there was a reason she didn't intervene immediately. She could have called in the security officer on the spot and used her position to bring the room to silence, but instead, she chose to wait. She let the situation unfold, observing closely to see who in the crowd was siding with the challenger. When she checked the list of attendees handed to her, she noticed 3 local journalists with ties to Camilla's family. They were positioned at the edge, watching the altercation with keen interest, realizing it wasn't simply a random outburst, but rather a planned media stunt. The Princess Royal had faced a smear campaign for months, as she had been the main obstacle to the push from Camilla's family for more control over administrative matters. She had thwarted their efforts to change the estate management rules and insisted on a rigorous audit recently put in place, standing as a barrier between their ambitions and the crown's wealth. As she rode back, a new question emerged in her mind. Who had leaked details about the audit to Camilla's family to begin with? That information was highly confidential, known only to 4 individuals present when the directive was issued. As she pieced together the timeline, it became clear that the leak must have originated from the king's private office. With that thought, she decided to reach out to a contact in the intelligence services asking for a trace on the email traffic concerning the estate audit. She arrived at the palace, determined to trace any signs back to potential betrayal. As the guardian of the gate, she wasn't about to let the matter rest. Stepping into the building, surrounded by portraits of the past, she headed straight to her desk. Knowing Prince William was hard at work in his office, also investigating the leak, she began to sift through her file on estate management, cross-referencing signatures from the audit documents. She started identifying disturbing patterns, noticing how Camilla's family had been trying to maneuver their way into key personnel decisions, slowly taking over the institution. This wasn't merely about a cottage or a job, it was a strategic move to control the monarchy's power. That realization fueled her resolve to become the main investigator. She intended to collect evidence of sabotage and present it to the king, forcing him to make a choice between his marriage and the crown's survival. Late into the night, she sat cold and focused at her desk, knowing the challenger had made a grave error by targeting someone like her, who wouldn't back down. Meanwhile, Prince William was in full-on administrative mode. Arriving in the briefing room at 5 minutes past 6, he didn't bother to take off his coat. He walked to the center of the table, setting his phone down on the polished surface. 5 senior aides were gathered before him, each with a report on the day's happenings. Without saying a word, he pointed to the screen on the wall, playing raw footage from the horticultural show, the sharp sound of the shutter click punctuating the room. As he observed, he focused on his aunt and Laura Lopes. Once the clip concluded, he turned off the projector with a decisive click and questioned why a woman barred from official engagement lists was allowed inside the hall. He fixed his gaze on the director of security, who opened his mouth to offer an explanation, but William interrupted him. He didn't want an excuse. He demanded to know which staff member had bypassed the screening protocols. He made it clear that the person responsible would be dismissed before the morning news cycle. This situation was bigger than just a security lapse. It was about the integrity of the command structure. Over the past 2 months, William had been actively working to cleanse the household of those loyal to Camilla's family. He understood he was dealing with a battle on 2 fronts, the public opinion and internal issues. When an aide mentioned that the invitation had originated from a regional branch, William inquired if that branch had been informed about the limitations regarding Camilla's family. The aide acknowledged this. Then, William pressed for an explanation on why the warning was overlooked. The aide fidgeted in his seat and admitted there was pressure from higher up. When William demanded a name, the aide fell silent. William opened a secure folder marked Internal Influencers. For weeks, he had been tracking links between the staff and Camilla's family, and he uncovered the source of the pressure. It traced back to a mid-level manager connected to a personal assistant within Camilla's household. He shut the folder and instructed the director of security to remove that manager from the building immediately. He also called for the suspension of the personal assistant while a thorough investigation took place. He officially declared Camilla's household a restricted zone, enforcing that no one could move between the offices without his written permission. In less than 20 minutes, security officers escorted the manager out, sending a clear message. Prince William was no longer just the heir waiting in line. He was now the one in charge, cleansing the ranks and making certain everyone on staff recognized who held the authority. Soon after, another troubling detail surfaced. William's team had caught wind of several phone calls between Camilla's private line and a legal firm in the city, coinciding with the audit schedule. He suspected Camilla was gearing up for a legal fight, likely trying to shield assets that the audit aimed to seize. He turned to his chief legal advisor, asking if there was any possibility of freezing the accounts before the law firm could intervene. The advisor cautioned that it would be a challenge since those assets were held in trusts and technically outside the palace's control. William studied the map on the wall, pointing to the properties under scrutiny, and requested that each of those titles be examined for secondary liens. The Prince of Wales was seething but kept his composure. After witnessing years of the institution endure scandal and the dignity of the crown being compromised by personal interests, he resolved to be the one to put a stop to it. His objective wasn't compromise, he was aiming for a total restoration of order. Looking out at the city lights from the window when he thought about his children and the future he was leaving for them, he realized that if the monarchy continued in its current state, it wouldn't survive another generation. He had to be the barrier that halted the decline. He instructed his team that for the next 48 hours, their priority would be total containment. No more leaks, no public confrontations. Anyone who talked to the press would face serious consequences based on their contracts. He reached out to the king, informing him he had managed the fallout from the Hall incident and was ready to enter the next phase of restructuring. Hesitation was no longer an option. He required the king's public support and needed him to sign a decree that would remove Camilla's family from all official palace duties. The king agreed, exhausted by the ongoing drama and conflicts. He had witnessed the footage and felt the sting of the disrespect. He was prepared to let his son take the lead. William informed his team that the decree would be crafted that night and delivered to Camilla the following morning. Meanwhile, on the other side of this drama, Laura Lopes sat in the living room of their country estate, surrounded by half-packed boxes as she scrolled through the news comments. The screen was filled with hateful remarks, and people called her names while questioning her right to speak. A cold tightness settled in her chest. She had intended to defend her mother, but instead felt like she was igniting an institutional disaster. Resentment had been simmering for months, beginning when Camilla's staff was reassigned to the central pool. It intensified when their travel budgets were cut, and it grew personal when security details were stripped from Camilla's family members. Laura and her siblings had always been part of the inner circle, and now they felt like unwelcomed guests. The shift was abrupt and painful. Just then, her brother walked in after checking the news feeds. He told Laura that their personal bank accounts were being scrutinized, with the bank sending a letter requiring verification for any transfers over £5,000. This was a clear indication that the palace's audit had reached into their private finances. They were feeling the pressure from every angle, straight to voicemail, leaving Laura feeling even more isolated. She remembered all those meetings in the estate offices, how influential they had been over the estate contracts. It was hard to wrap her head around the fact that just like that, their lives were being unraveled by Prince William. The thought that hit Laura the hardest was why Camilla hadn't stepped in to protect them. She had expected her mother to leverage her position for a compromise, to reach out on their behalf. Yet Camilla had chosen silence, retreating to her private home like a ghost. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that her mother was prioritizing the crown over her own children. Then came a courier with a package from Camilla's personal lawyer. Inside was a letter advising them to stay completely silent. It warned that any public actions would lead to a total legal severance from the royal estate. This wasn't abandonment, Laura realized. It was a desperate plea for survival. Camilla wasn't throwing them under the bus. She was trying to keep them from landing in jail. The letter also revealed that Prince William had uncovered systemic irregularities, and he was building a case that might go to criminal authorities. The audit had revealed a confusing trail of fund transfers, which added to Laura's sense of dread. They had acted carelessly, treating the royal household like a mere resource instead of the institution it was meant to be. Then came a disturbing realization. When Laura tried to contact a third-party firm managing their private trust accounts, she found the line dead. The number was disconnected. William had gone beyond the palace walls. He had dismantled the protections around their private assets. Looking out the window, Laura scanned the long driveway, expecting to see the security vehicles that had been by their side for years. They were nowhere to be found. The palace had pulled their protection, leaving them to fend for themselves. After years of living under the royal name's safeguard, they were now mere targets for the public and the press. Moira's call to her mother's private line only reached voicemail, intensifying Laura's feeling of abandonment. Generic voicemail, and the frustration built up inside her. She felt like screaming and wanted nothing more than to return to the palace and demand answers. But every move she considered would undoubtedly be monitored. William seemed to have eyes everywhere, bolstered by the power of the throne. She was up against a man with the backing of the law, the media, and the institution itself, making her realize she was fighting a battle already lost. Sitting in the dim light, staring at the boxes, she reflected on the privileged life they once led, a life filled with access and security that rested on the monarchy's foundations. They had taken it all for granted, believing their power was forever secure, but they were mistaken. The monarchy was moving on, leaving them behind. The divide had become permanent. There was no turning back now. William was busy crafting a new reality, eliminating influences he considered detrimental to the throne, and Camilla's family had already started to find themselves on the outside. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, damage control was in high gear. An emergency meeting was hastily arranged for 6 in the morning, held in a nondescript basement room that was thick with the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. 3 senior communications team members sat around the table, their eyes bloodshot from working through the night, while a large screen displayed a live feed of social media reactions. The outlook was bleak. As negative engagement had surged to 4 million interactions, the palace had lost control of the narrative. The video showcasing the confrontation had gone viral, appearing on every major platform, dissected in slow motion and translated into 6 languages. Meanwhile, the palace's official channels remained silent for 12 hours, a silence that was perceived as a sign of weakness, allowing the public to fill the gap with their own speculations. The fallout was escalating. Then, the director of communications arrived, tossing a folder onto the table. Inside was a draft of an official statement, a masterpiece of legal evasion that didn't mention any names. It merely described the incident as a misunderstanding at a public function and pledged a review of event security. It was structured to convey absolutely nothing. One of the aides quickly pushed the folder aside, insisting the draft wouldn't work. She pointed out to the director that the public was no longer willing to accept vague excuses. Showing him the latest data made it clear people were not interested in a security review. What they wanted was an acknowledgement of the situation. Happy with the events at hand, by the end of the meeting, the palace security team had pivoted their investigation, initially suspecting a catering staff member for the video leak, but it turned out that a freelancer hired by a local radio station was the real culprit. This station had gotten the access code from the same regional director who had invited Laura Lopes, meaning he was in on this from start to finish, not just making small talk. The radio station had dropped £10,000 for the exclusive footage, and the payment had gone through a shell company, which raised alarm bells. The palace's legal team quickly prepared to take action, demanding the seizure of the files and planning a lawsuit against the regional director for breach of contract and willful endangerment of a royal. They were dead set on making an example out of everyone involved, but the one nagging question was why someone like this regional director, known for having a clean record and being a quiet soul from a small town, would risk so much. As palace investigators dug into his financial history, they stumbled upon a series of mysterious payments that totaled a staggering £100,000. When Prince William found out about these discoveries, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of anger, it was a calculated effort to damage the royal family's reputation. He instructed his team to trace the origin of those payments, suspecting they might be linked to an international portfolio he'd uncovered in an earlier investigation. Camilla's family didn't act out of mere sentiment. They were driven by financial strain. As he prepared for a press conference at 10 o'clock, William decided to break from tradition. Instead of the usual royal correspondence, he invited top investigative reporters from national newspapers. His strategy focused on transparency, intending to reveal the evidence of a coordinated smear campaign. He planned to show the public that this confrontation was a setup, turning the narrative on Camilla's family by portraying them as the aggressors rather than the victims. The atmosphere in the briefing room charged with anticipation. Reporters were accustomed to dull, scripted updates, so this was anything but ordinary. William stepped up to the platform, relying on his notes instead of a teleprompter. He detailed the timeline of the situation and made clear connections between the regional director and the questionable payments. He laid out how the shell companies were involved, getting straight to the point. He declared that the institution faced an organized assault aiming to undermine the monarchy for selfish reasons. Though he didn't mention any names, everyone in the room understood whom he was referencing. He wrapped up by announcing the initiation of a criminal investigation, leaving without addressing the media. The narrative took a sharp turn. It was no longer just a family squabble, but rather a serious criminal conspiracy. Public interest shifted to the corruption allegations, and any sympathy previously felt for Laura Lopez rapidly disappeared as attention focused on the financial misdeeds. William had effectively regained control and changed the momentum of the situation. By the following Monday, when sunlight streamed through the empty Privy Council chamber, only two men stood at opposite ends of a long table. Prince William held a formal decree made of thick cream-colored paper and pushed it toward the king. The ink was still a bit wet, carrying a straightforward message. Effective immediately, Camilla's family's official status was revoked. There would be no more invitations to state events, no funding from estate accounts, and no professional ties with the royal household. This was an order, not a request, meant to ensure the institution's survival. The king studied the page for a moment, running his finger over the royal seal before signing his name without lifting his gaze. He understood that this signified the closure of a personal chapter in his life. He had wished for a different outcome and had hoped that his family could find a way to coexist. However, the evidence before him told a different story. He noticed the papers on the desk that detailed the smear campaigns and the financial records, revealing how his wife's family had exploited the monarchy as if it were their own private piggy bank. It hit him hard that he had been safeguarding a real threat. Meanwhile, a messenger had already been sent to Camilla's country estate with a second copy of the decree, set to arrive by noon. The palace staff waited anxiously for her response, braced for an appeal. The hours went by, and the afternoon faded into evening, yet the phone in the king's office remained silent. Finally, a courier returned from the country estate, bringing an empty envelope with him. Camilla had signed the receipt for the decree without a word, not asking for a meeting and accepting the terms of her isolation. This act felt less like compliance and more like a retreat into a full-blown conflict. Now, there's a lingering question in the palace. If Camilla is quiet, what is she planning next? The security team noted that she had cleared out her remaining personal belongings from the main residence, stripping the house of her presence entirely. Meanwhile, Prince William stood at the window, gazing out at the dark courtyard. He had secured the house, but the family was lost. The battle was finished, and the monarchy found itself isolated. The line in the sand had been drawn, forever altering the House of Windsor. By stripping away the status of Camilla's family, Prince William effectively closed the door on an era of internal influence, reclaiming the throne's authority. However, Camilla's unsettling silence indicates that this conflict is far from resolved. While she has retreated, the stage is still set for an unexpected final move. Has the monarchy truly eliminated its greatest threats, or have they simply been pushed into the shadows? The crown may stand alone, yet the silence within the palace carries significant weight.